Welcome to the Either Or podcast, a podcast where we talk about historical figures in philosophy and contemporary philosophical problems. I'm Aidan Clark, joined alongside my co-hosts Enzo Cavazzi and Helena Lang. Today we're talking about Franz Kafka. Kafka was a German-speaking writer born in the modern-day Czech Republic, formerly part of the long-forgotten Austro-Hungarian Empire. He wrote such famous works as The Trial, The Castle, The Metamorphosis, as well as countless short stories and personal diary entries and letters. Kafka is perhaps best encapsulated by the words he said to his doctor on his deathbed, dying of TB, "Kill me or it's murder." Enzo thought he would start the podcast with a reading from a very, very short story of Kafka's called The Departure. Over to you, Enzo.
The Departure. I ordered my horse to be brought from the stables. The servant did not understand my orders, so I went to the stable myself, saddled my horse, and mounted. In the distance, I heard the sound of a trumpet, and I asked the servant what it meant. He knew nothing and had heard nothing. At the gate, he stopped me and asked, "Where's the master going?" "I don't know," I said. "Just out of here, just out of here." "Out of here, nothing else. It's the only way I can reach my goal." "So you know your goal?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "I've just told you, out of here, that's my goal." I chose this short story of Kafka to highlight the deceptive nature of Kafka's writing and perhaps the importance of talking about it and unpacking it, right? So I often talk about the Kafka treasure trove or the treasure hunt, which is quite different from, our youthful fantasies of the pirates where you get to there's an X on the map. And once you've unpacked the treasure, you get the riches, or you get, the untold treasures or something. There's a deceptive nature to this treasure hunt in Kafka. And here we have a story of a kind of almost like a traditional, almost like medieval story of a master settling for departure and his servant. And you get a glimpse of the interrelationships, the communication issues in Kafka, the dissonance, the misunderstandings, right? So the master is settling, the master is leaving, and then the servant is asking, "Where are you going?" The master says, "Out of here, that's where I'm going. This is the only way I can reach my goal." And the servant understands that as a way to say, I'm just getting away. But then, no, his goal is out of here. This is really, ultimately, the goal is out of here. As long as he's out of here, that's his goal.
This is, a very interesting example. And you've brought up something that earlier, before we started recording, we described as the Kafka paradox, that the writing is deceptively easy and often quite clear. And in fact, Kafka really tried hard to achieve that clarity. It was not, necessarily just something that just flowed out of him. It was something that he worked for at great pains to get that clarity in the writing. So we have that on the one hand. And then on the other hand, this sense that his writing is hard to unpack. This sort of sets out the problem well of why we are talking about Kafka on this podcast about philosophy. Reading philosophy and reading Kafka, it's actually a similar experience sometimes because you have the introduction of another layer to the text. It's not just what the text is saying, but also how it is saying it and how these layers relate. In this example that you gave, we have this master who tells the servant, "I just want to go." And then the presumption of the servant, which isn't really explained, is there is some outer goal to that going out. But then the master explains that, no, doing this is my only goal. This is a nice example for how the text kind of refers back to itself and kind of messes up a little bit what you thought a text could do.
You mentioned the great lengths that Kafka went to clarify or to really concentrate his writing. And I think you're right, the clarity is there, especially in the original in German, but there's almost like a frightening clarity to his writing, which is all the more emphasized in the famous stories like The Metamorphosis, right? We have these graphic, vivid images of, waking up as a vermin, right? It's often mistranslated as a cockroach. It's not as graphic as that. These vivid images, which sound nightmarish, but, are quite real in the clarity of the writing. You mentioned, right, that he went to great lengths, but it also flowed out of him. So that's the discrepancy. He not only went to great lengths, especially at night. So Kafka was actually not that well known during his lifetime. He was a union injury lawyer of renown. He was working for civil cases of, at work accidents or something of that sort. And he was writing mostly at night. Most of his stories flowed out of him quite rapidly, span of a couple of days, a couple of months. Kafka suffered from tremendous writer's block as well, which he often used productively in his writings, love writings to other people to talk about how troubled he is, how stuck he is in his writing. He both went to great lengths, but also the writing itself flowed in a way that I rarely see in other writers, sort of a feverish form of writing, of inspiration.
Yeah, I think you guys have given us some great lines with which to analyze this story, in particular, the departure, and in analyzing it, try and understand something about Kafka himself generally and the philosophical task of reading and analyzing Kafka. I mean, I love frightening clarity is great. It's rather like with a dream. A dream can also come to one with frightening clarity, but it doesn't help one to understand it. And if anything, the clarity of it is all the more shocking, traumatizing because of that. And I also like this idea that what you said, Helena, this sort of changing what a text can do and what we think a text can do, and the level of sort of self-reference or reflexivity in a text. You almost might say that the text kind of tortures itself, but not just in giving us a certain story in which there's a very difficult theme, say, or disputation, sort of as we might see in a work by Dostoevsky's two characters engaged in a great debate. Instead, the text itself is at war with itself, what it's supposed to be, how it's supposed to be read. But I think we should avoid seeing this as some kind of anticipation of a postmodern turn and understand something about, one, the philosophy of Kafka, and two, actually about the historical setting in which Kafka is writing, all of which are contained again brilliantly in this story, The Departure. So to the philosophy, the idea of a goal that kind of tortures its own setting. So out of here, at first sounds like it's completely integratable within the master-servant relationship. And then it's revealed upon a shift in perspective that it's the dissolution of this very social bond or arrangement. And this shift in perspective is precisely a shift in the very frame of the story. All that takes place in the story is the confusion of the people as to the shift in perspective. But the story itself hangs upon the shift in perspective and is trying to set up a shift in perspective within the narrative frame itself. And this points directly to the historical conditions as well. I mean, Kafka was born in the early 1880s, and he died pretty early in the 1920s. And, Europe had gone through a world war. The old monarchies had died, and the last great empire had ended, the Habsburg monarchy. And it's perhaps not unsurprising that a writer who was not Czech or German, actually, but should be accurately described as Habsburg, or again, Prague Habsburg, inherits also the literary challenge of having to represent the dissolution of the old social bonds. These bonds, again, are not just dissolved and what is revealed is a functional, liberal democracy, the end of all arbitrary institutions, and the fossils of the feudal order, and the accomplishment of the age of revolutions. Obviously, Kafka's literary style, his characters, the confusion, the uncertainty, the typical theme of anxiety, reveal in what respect this transition functions very much as the transition, if we can call it that, functions in the story, The Departure itself. And this gets at the stakes, in a sense, of trying to represent an historical change or a change in a character. And in a sense, in Kafka, it all kind of bleeds together. There's a collapse between content and form. This highlights something about Kafka's challenge himself, not simply to come up with stories, legends, literary folklore, or to come up with a certain artistic personality, say like a James Joyce type, but to come up itself with the very instrument by which you will engage in the narration of personal or public traumas, and in some cases, vivid political traumas, changes in the very state and arrangement of things when there is a collapse of a collective social language or a collapse of collectivity itself, when there's a collapse in representation or in language. Again, one thinks of dreams here. And the question, which was also the epically Freudian question, who is doing his research at the same time as Kafka is writing, is what is the language for dreams, for the unconscious, but also for anxiety and for political society in these unbearable traumatic transitions?
You mentioned that Kafka belonged to a Czech-speaking Prague at the time, but as a German minority, but also we have to mention the muted Jewishness of his background as well, which, he inherited from his parents, especially his father, who was a bit more involved with the Jewish culture and community. He was a bit less, as he never aged tremendously, right? He died fairly young, but as years went by, I think he was trying to reconnect with his Jewishness to some degree. His best friend and literary executive after his passing, Max Brod, which we have to thank for going against Kafka's deathbed request to burn all of his stories, decided to keep most of them. We have to thank him for that. Another part of the tripling minority, or whatever the postmodern term is for Kafka's background.
I think you're right to point out as well the sort of fourth minority of the unpublishedness, if we can consider that a sort of character of someone's identity or literary ethnicity. And so many of Kafka's novels were unfinished. The stories that were finished are also curiously engaged, as you already mentioned, in the disaster of his attempt maybe not to leave any particular literary legacy, and the opposition of his editor, as well. Even within certain short stories, you get this conflict itself of reading, writing, surveillance, publishing. I mean, again, Kafka is remembered in a sense as this great existentialist writer, which is maybe the fifth minority trait we should maybe complicate, though. Because I don't think Kafka should be remembered as simply a writer for the anxious generation, who felt lost in the sort of, again, the shadow of the Habsburg Empire, as some people have put it, principally because what many of these characterizations of Kafka tend to assume, and they relate him to figures like Dostoevsky or Kierkegaard, is that, well, there's this collective problem, to an extent, with God, with the monarchy, with collective political society, and how to organize one's life. But often the existentialist account is very reductive to a question of personal liberty. And Kafka himself and his protagonists are represented as if they're characters who don't get along with society, don't fit in, which is a total misreading, in a sense, of the anxiety, again, that Kafka is trying to paradoxically represent, and which makes him so interested, again, not only in anxiety, but as I mentioned, in surveillance, in cultural composition, in the question of fitting in itself. That is not simply, do I have the kind of right, like a French writer like Sartre, to be myself, existence over essence, exercise of personal liberty, against the orthodoxy and absurdism of the ruling order, which only generates even more hypocrisy upon the catastrophe of something like World War I and the decade that follows, leading up, to the financial crash of 29, the Nazis, and so on, all of which, in a rather uncanny way, Kafka himself anticipated. But this complication of, okay, once all these old orders have failed, we're now faced with the rather difficult question of how to fit in at all without any naive social guarantees. And unlike, say, Friedrich Nietzsche, who saw this as this romantic, difficult responsibility, Kafka does not indulge in any attempt to provide a heroic setting for the challenge of fitting in, or the challenge of reestablishing the very collective contract on the basis of which we fit in to something.
As you're trying to complicate this existentialist minority or this identity in Kafka, I think it's worth mentioning, if we're comparing, for example, the Russian idea of the superfluous man, or even in the French sense of, having the flaneur, or the person who sort of is on the outskirts of the, the social structure, or the community or something. Whereas Kafka's protagonists, especially in the novels, which are all unfinished, by the way, except the short stories, all of his novels were unfinished for different reasons. But Kafka's protagonists are all enmeshed. They all have an important part to play in society, right? For example, in Der Prozess, the trial, the protagonist K, right? As you get to learn, they're all sort of images of Kafka, but never quite Kafka, right? We have to be careful about that. They're all named K, Joseph K, but never Joseph Kafka, never the full name. K works in a bank, has an important position, or somewhat of an important position in a bank. In the castle, the main character, who is a land surveyor, who is tasked with grasping or settling property of the land, a land we never see. We never get to the insides of the walls. It's always, right, the outskirts. Or in America, a new immigrant story from the US, but someone from a seemingly well-to-do family who, unfortunately, due to having, an altercation, or, whether or not we call it sexual abuse, but some form of sexual encounter with his housemaid, made her pregnant and had to leave out of shame to the US, which Kafka has never been, only read in stories. Just to say that, if we were to grant this existentialist identity to Kafka, it'd be quite different, perhaps, to the French or the Russian counterparts that we mentioned, right? In the sense that the characters are not sort of sore thumbs or sort of externalities of the system, but they're quite enmeshed in it, and that's where the struggle really stems from.
It's interesting that you point out, Enzo, that they are quite well integrated into society. Joseph K. working for a bank and so on. I think in that respect, America is actually less typical, because you have this story of this emigration. But maybe what the character of America does share with someone like Joseph K. is that there is this kind of inner monologue, a sort of inner view of the situation going on, that does still make sense to the character, and where everything is kind of integratable, and they consider all possible conditions in a situation. Like there's definitely also an element of anxiety there. So you have that inner state or inner monologue, but then as it were on the outside, you have this different layer where you can see, and where the character also over and over painfully experience that things do go wrong, despite this inner monologue that seemingly had considered everything, and in which they try to figure out to do the right thing. So I think, you're both right to point out that it's not just, that there's one subject that somehow doesn't get along with society or with other people, but it's more this gap between what they think is going on and how they see the situation, and then what actually happens, and that the stuff that actually happens still applies to them. It's not like they're this outcast and the consequences of what happens don't apply to them because they've been able to extricate themselves. No, they still remain in the situation, and the consequences do still apply to them.
Looking at it first, right, America was the first novel by Kafka, so it might be a reason why it's seemingly different from the other ones. But I do think, right, first of all, when Kafka passed, Max Brod went through Kafka's writings and edited some of them, right? So yes, we have to thank him for giving us the possibility of reading those stories, but there's some points when looking at back at the original manuscripts that Kafka wrote and Max Brod's editing, that we have to point at Max Brod and sort of blame him for some of the things. So America is the title given by Max Brod himself, not Kafka. Kafka chose a much more interesting title, I think. German would be like Der Verschollene, or the one who disappeared, right? And here you'd assume, because it's a story of immigration, especially at the time, of someone sent away out of shame from his family to make ends meet, someone quite young, almost like a pre-adult, having to mend for himself in this new, big, curious expanse that is the United States. But actually, I would propose that the man who disappeared didn't disappear in the US by, going away, and this sort of idea of the departure, but disappeared into the systems, right? So as we progress along the story, You're mentioning this inner monologue, and one of the things that Kafka is an expert at is not necessarily the sort of excessive inner monologue, but I think what is called in German the erlebte Rede, but this sort of idea of having a participating narrator, but that fools you, that sort of gives you what you think is the voice of authority, what he's participating, he's really giving you the information that you need, but he's always kind of duping you in some way. And as you progress along America, you realize, as the protagonist moves along here, he tries first to settle with his uncle. His uncle kicks him out, and then he moves, he tries to mesh within the structures of the hotel, and then there's a circus which embodies in excess this sort of this weird disappearing into the system where everybody's included, everybody can be part of the circus in America. Sort of this idea of disappearing into the system rather than falling in the cracks of it. I'm giving this idea in order only to enforce my original point, which was to say that the protagonists or the characters in Kafka are not at the outskirts of social structures or political structures, but rather deeply entrenched in them, and that causes the tensions, the miscommunications, the paradoxes in Kafka, and also the nightmarish reality that we often call Kafkaesque.
What do you guys make about perhaps the element of shame and guilt that is quite a recurrent topic both in Kafka's life and in his writing?
If I might, we might afford ourselves a little bit more historical precision, which can also lend some depth to the conversation. I think that shame and guilt are a great example because it brings us right to Freud, and it also characterizes a certain kind of person that seemed to exist right from the 1880s until about the 1920s. For Freud, it was the neurotic or the Viennese hysteric. But in the case of the immigrant, there's an interesting story of people who know the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. His father actually immigrated briefly to the United States and taught mathematics and German and violin and was gone for about 4 or 5 years and then came back and became one of the wealthiest men in continental Europe, became a steel industrialist, and he was from Austria. When we look at all the sort of Kafka characters, and we sort of maybe do observe to some extent they're all quite bourgeois, it's not even about money. It has to do with the production of this social identity called the bourgeois, to an extent the middle class, and the capacity of society to sustain the contract of identity culturally and even economically. And this is partly, the nightmare that Europe then goes through when World War I strikes, which is, in a sense, waiting to happen long before World War I bursts out. And then writers like Kafka are obliged to try and both live through and then reconstruct, which also gives us a very good image of this over-intimacy of Kafka himself and of his characters, which we're trying to characterize here. Like, what is it about the fact that they're not just external? Well, an even weirder way of saying it is not only they're not external, but there's something inside the Kafka characters, right? This racing, endlessly rationalizing monologue, which, as you pointed out, Helena, is more defined by this gap between what it says and what actually happens, the kind of broken causality, which also goes to the heart of the unfinishedness of the novels, the unfinishability, we might say, of the novels, itself a philosophical and literary problem. This gap gets at the heart of how these characters are meant to not simply rationalize what is going on in front of them, but the extent to which they seem taken over by something which is, to borrow the classic Lacanian phrase, in them more than themselves, right? Something which is almost forcing them to do this, to engage in these impossible rationalizations. And it's worth mentioning that for someone like Freud, what is this if not the unconscious, to some extent? What makes this kind of dynamic possible is the unconscious. And maybe this sketches a little bit why Kafka's problem is so difficult, both as a literary and in a sense as a philosophical project, because he's trying to confront the paradox of something which is unconscious, not simply not there, but missing, right? Not simply a guy who has disappeared, but, a proper disappearance, we might even say, of reality itself, which fairly, I think, contrasts this classic version of Kafka, right? as someone who is describing bureaucracy, which is this emergent structure that tries to organize the impossible collectivity of Europe at this moment, which is already there in the 19th century, in the post-Napoleonic world, right? If you can't beat them, join them. And in a sense, the powers, after the destruction of Napoleon's political and imperial project, there's a unification to create a society that just continues Napoleon by another route, whether it's the Holy Alliance and the endless hypocrisy, however, of trying to maintain ultimately the pure subjective point that was the French Revolution, the explosive moment of freedom, right? Pure politically defended freedom, which is maybe where existentialism gets its roots, Dostoevsky, and even the Nietzschean project, and sketches again this sort of, for us, maybe not quite satisfactory existentialist project, but was already the problem itself of European political society. We have this, again, this one Kafka on one side of fitting into this bureaucracy, but the bureaucracy is functional, and the other version of Kafka, which says, well, but bureaucracy itself is a kind of theater. Even political collectivity is a kind of theater. It has the structure of fiction, the structure of a dream, so that when you take, again, the castle, the land surveyor who goes in and has to try and figure out almost literally the dimensions of this castle and try and figure out who owns it and who runs it and the social dynamics of this castle. Why is this such a good image for Kafka and a metaphor for the impossible project of, say, European political collectivity? Not simply because there is some possible utopia where, if we just accepted each other, we would fit in. Such as a story where the castle is simply run by some dictator who's not very nice, but he really exists, and eventually there's some moment where the owner of the castle is convinced to sort of open it up and free it to the people. In this sense, maybe this was the naive dream of the French Revolution. Cutting off the head of Louis was never going to be enough, because the much more traumatizing thing was well, what status does political collectivity happen once you've cut off the head, even of the monarch? And in a sense, one gets through Kafka this headless monarchy, right? And this is a good description of bureaucracy. The castle is a kind of headless, leaderless, lordless castle or feudal arrangement. In other words, the schemes of production and social functionality remain, but the engine, as it were, is kind of missing. And the castle, in a sense, also reflects already the characters of Kafka, who have this burdensome inner monologue that actually doesn't seem to be coming from within, in the sense of they're simply trying to coordinate, from within the depths of their existential angst and problem, how to remain authentic or true despite the imposition of alienating bureaucratic, technologized society. But on the contrary, you get this torture within the character of an inner monologue that is not their own, but seems to be coming from outside. It has sort of taken hold within, and the castle itself has exactly this structure, as does the story with which we began, the departure, the collapse of the very setting of the castle with the naive content of the castle. Again, you do not have this good emblem or metaphor of a functioning, say, feudal society or monarchical society. You have the kind of indivisible remainder, the pure remainder of the castle, the pure fiction and theater of the castle, but there's no obvious way for how to integrate it into quote-unquote reality, or to come up with a political social reality that can capture and integrate the significance of the castle. And in a sense, to maybe get back to the question that Helena originally asked about anxiety and shame, I mean, the overwhelming experience of a person in such a situation would be that of shame, but in a rather Freudian way, right? Not the shame of some secret that I have that I unburden myself with by telling my analyst or telling the world, which of course is the classic guilt of the existentialist character who feels as if there's some reason why society has rejected him or her. But in Kafka's stories, the secret is much more devastating. It's not a specific secret, a specific piece of information or content. It's the pure frame or theater of the secret, the pure frame or theater of the unconscious, what Helena referred to earlier as the gap itself, which currently, in Kafka's time, collective political society basically has no answer for. It isn't simply a question of coming up with a bridge between the two sides of the gap or rejecting the gap entirely, but how can you have a collective political society in which such a gap exists, which no economics or even naive political philosophies can ever conceal or cover up? So, in other words, the secret inside me, inside my heart, is not something personal to me, which I am refusing to tell or have and feel guilt and shame over, but an absolute or pure guilt and shame over the fact that I have the secret, the public secret of political society itself, which is something like the unconscious exists. There is this gap in the project of political society itself, which we cannot just cover up and conceal.
About guilt and shame, I think there's a ton of beautiful examples in Kafka, right? Varying examples of that impossibility or that gap that you've been mentioning. Perhaps the most famous would be in the trial, right? Another K, this time Joseph K wakes up in the morning with policemen or investigators in his room, already an intrusion there. And he's not yet convicted, but he's pronounced guilty of a crime, a nameless crime, which he has to present himself to the court a couple of times. This sort of impossibility of being guilty but being innocent is what ultimately wears down Joseph K. So it's not really the guilt of having done something, even though there's, as you read the story, especially at the beginning, there's a glimpse of potential, sexual abuse with his roommate, Colin Bauer, which is another reference to his own life, FB, Felicia Bauer, which is Kafka's own love affair. But nothing of that is explicitly given in the story, right? It's something that we as readers expect would be the crime of Joseph K. Yeah, what ultimately wears him down at the end, or we suspect, is not of him having a secret, but of him lacking the secret to confess, of him lacking the ability to confess, which is, for example, if we were to compare to another classic existentialist story of guilt and crime and punishment, where, as the story goes, for people who have read it, right, the protagonist, whose name escapes me totally right now, after having committed the crime out of convenience, goes sick, consumed by the guilt. And here, it's totally different, right? He's worn down in the attempt to protect himself against a crime he hasn't committed, but has no recourse to do so. I was also going to mention that one of the ways in which that gap, the gap between how things are perceived through this inner monologue and how things actually appear to the reader or to the protagonists in the story, is how space is embodied, or how space plays a huge part in Kafka's stories. I mean, The Castle, right, the latest of his unfinished novels, is a great example of that, because the protagonist directly plays the role of surveying the land, surveying the space. Kafka's intention, at least, were not to create this utopia, this hazy utopia that could be cleared up, that finally we could be, through some revolutionary volition, finally be able to survey the land, but that somehow the paradox is that you only ever get to the outskirts of the land. Even if you're still so far from the center of authority, you're seeing that, the master of the land, its power is still felt throughout. The same way that in the trial, even if he's never received publicly in a legitimate court, if you want to call it the theaters that Joseph K. is attending, and the dizzying rooms, the endless back and forth throughout the city and the labyrinths of bureaucracy that he goes through, he never really gets to someone who can tell him what's going on. And it's actually quite weird. It's actually only the painter who paints the face of the judges, who lives in the attic with children running around. It's only the painter of the judges who's able to tell him with confidence what's going on with his case. So this sort of weird dissonance with this situation. The same thing with the land surveyor in The Castle, right? That it's only by being able to sleep with one of the women there, who has a very minor role, that he's able to attain some form of legitimate, somewhat stable positioning in the land that he's trying to survey. So this sort of weird anchoring through minor relationships is quite interesting, and speaks to this weird dissonance again of space. not only space, but also embodiment as well, and body. So if someone is powerful in Kafka, especially his father, for example, when he speaks of his father or authorial figure, they're giant, they're enormous, they're fat, they're healthy. There's a sort of morbid, and Kafka himself was quite frail, right? So he died of tuberculosis, but he was quite frail and pretty tall as well, but he quite emaciated at the end. He had struggle eating and swallowing for a couple of years before his passing. He was, I think, under 100 pounds when he passed away, and over 6 foot tall. So it just gives you an idea of how emaciated he really got. Quite a great story that mirrors Kafka's relationship with not only confession, right, this oral ability to speak, not only to his father, but also a consuming of taking things in, which is the story about the hunger artist, the forgotten artistry of hunger artists who would go in circus and tell everybody, "Hey, I'm gonna starve myself for 30 days. Come see the show." This sort of forgotten art weirdly mirrors Kafka's own troubles with writer's block and his inability to dish out or to perform his circus of writing. But yeah, going back to my point about the embodiment of the gap, right? That somehow power is displayed with this enormous. Some of Kafka's women, again in the story, there's one in America who takes him in the hotel. This sort of fat lady who's also seemingly is able to speak German, of German origin. She's stabilized herself in America, and through that stabilization, through the power she's acquired, she's also gained weight. She's enormous. She has some form of anchoring in the land herself. Joseph K. or Kafka himself is quite small, like often represented as a mouse, or the minuscule. I think those enormous and minuscule dualities are quite important to think about when we think about the power structures in Kafka and that representation of the gap.
I think it's also important, though, maybe to complicate the question of weight. I mean, Kafka is sort of trying to give weight to nothing. I mean, in the same way that the mind, the dream work, in trying to represent psychic disorders or issues, or even trauma itself, gives the most elaborate textures in dreams to a problem. But Freud's entire insight is that it's sort of a texture for nothing. And in fact, Freud's insight is not actually to try and figure out what the latent meaning of the dream is, the really big problem, but to try and figure out the dynamics of the materiality of the dream itself. Why, nonetheless, your problem with, some sexual conflict or chooses to present itself in the strange way that it does. Famously, say the Wolfman. Why does the Wolfman have the dream where the wolves are on the trees outside his bedroom window? Why is he a child again, etc.? But this giving weight to nothing, obviously, as you're getting at, Enzo, exemplifies the power struggle. Just as a child sees an authority figure, so Kafka does, and Kafka's characters. And these caricatures of power, however, obviously indicate powerlessness, even in the very method of description. They're themselves desperate attempts to try and substantiate some sense of injunction, authority, or power, which, as we've already argued, is missing in Kafka when it comes to actually figuring out who is in charge. And I think you made this point already when you mentioned lack. The lack of guilt itself is what is so implicating. Almost as if any of Kafka's characters, particularly in the trial, if he had just admitted to some trivial guilt, right, if he had been caught up enough within the existing social reality to have some sort of trivial sense of what he might have done, he could have escaped the entire fantasy itself of seeing himself as guilty on the basis of which the entire theater of his guilt is constructed. All the labyrinths are a sort of subjective projection, as it were, of Kafka's character, and the surveillance undertaken by the quote-unquote state has very little to do, actually, with our caricature of totalitarian surveillance, and much more to do with the kernel of any sort of properly totalitarian society, which is that you're already guilty in some sense, insofar as you get to sort of choose the extent of your own guilt. You set up your own performance, and you play every character, and you choose all of the settings. And this definitely explains a certain aimlessness in the stories of Kafka, a sense of irresolution. Again, gets back to this distinction of unfinishedness versus unfinishability. But this also gets at the strange motif of sexuality in Kafka. And sexuality and lack, of course, have a very strange relationship. My lack of guilt implicates me in the very question, however, of setting up guilt itself. Not in any particular guilt, but in the very establishment of something like the law on the basis of which I am guilty. And the reason why Kafka's characters, in a sense, are so dangerous, why people like this are so dangerous, say for totalitarian societies, or for societies engaged in trying to repress the gap, which itself makes necessary the establishment of social reality and the law, is of course that in their very theater of anxiety, in the fact that they are so unbearably, unconsciously, these marionettes, as it were, but not, again, of the law. They're not perfect subjects of the law. They're sort of failed subjects of the law that embody the law even better in pointing out the pure frame or intervention or introduction of the law. This is what makes them so dangerous. They point out that the law at one point was installed, that it is a theater. And the law in Kafka, of course, in this caricature, rather like the enormous father, or enormous authority figure, is just capital L law, a pure law. When you look at earlier stories, as you mentioned, like Crime and Punishment, I think there is some defense of Dostoevsky's protagonist in Crime and Punishment, who not only does it sort of out of convenience, he kills the landlady or the pawnbroker, but he does it because he wants to do it. And in a sense, he wants to exercise this kind of crazy freedom, which Kafka would probably represent, not by him ever killing the woman, but by failing to even get to the point where he kills her, because the Kafka protagonist would be caught up in where did this freedom to kill suddenly come from. Again, in past naive political societies, murder was caught up in a functioning law, a feudal law, or a monarchical law where authority made sense. Not that Kafka is naive enough to believe that in any time in history this kind of law has existed, but this is, of course, the historical fantasy of the law, that it worked at some point, and now we've reached the point where the law doesn't work, but it's also impossible to ever set it up again, to reset it. And Dostoevsky's character, by contrast, does exercise this pure freedom, and he gets what he pays for. He does become a deeply anxious, sick character. In fact, he's already sick before he does it. So maybe that would have been, again, Kafka's version. He gets infected by freedom, which in and of itself implicates him in the question of where did this freedom already come from. Whereas Dostoevsky's character is engaged in the actual pure reflexive question of using this freedom for something. Kafka already thinks of this freedom as too problematic to be even made use of. Whereas the protagonist in Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov, does make use of this freedom, and it leads basically to nothing. And sort of famously or apocryphically, there is a third part of the title, Crime, Punishment, and Repentance, that Dostoevsky never ends up writing, the character who kind of does go through some process of rehabilitation. Of course, what happens instead, historically, is not rehabilitation, but revolution. There is an explosion of revolutionary attempts to wield this freedom in the context of continental Europe. And in a sense, to either pull a Raskolnikov, right, by actually naively trying to use this freedom, but without addressing the Kafkaesque problem of, but where did this freedom all of a sudden appear? And where was it to begin with? And this was, of course, Hegel's problem with, for instance, the French Revolution. His problem was, why, even though the French Revolution fails and collapses into the terror, do we nonetheless have to go through it? Well, in trying to tell a sort of total history of spirit and the phenomenology of spirit, Hegel basically tries to answer this question of where was the freedom already? Well, it was contained in a series of not even mistakes, but we could almost call them what Zizek calls hysterical theaters, but we could call them just Kafka-esque theaters. All of human history is a series of elaborate attempts or establishments of certain theaters of this freedom, which comes from nowhere, even before Kafka, even in the 12th century, the 6th century, 5,000 years ago. freedom comes from nowhere. It's a structure of reality, you might argue, this freedom from nowhere that nonetheless weighs upon us with this unbearable sense of injunction, right? This coincidence of responsibility and freedom. And all of human history is a series of Joseph K's who sort of established the theater of their own guilt with varying degrees of ideology, whether it's the Christian Revolution or the Jewish law is an even better example, or Roman nobility, or even Greek philosophy, or the Middle Ages, where you have these characters, as it were, who go through trying to answer the Hegelian question of, so where was this freedom already? And what they do is they structure this freedom in some particular ideological setup, some theater, again, Jewish law, Roman nobility, Greek wisdom, medieval virtue, whatever you want to call it. But of course, these ideologies collapse. What Kafka does, which is particularly exceptional, is he basically has this conflict in as pure terms as you can almost have it. His writing, his texts, are avoiding the attempt to supplement any particular ideology that will just ground this freedom, make it usable. And in a sense, he gives us the purest setting of, historical struggles themselves with respect to this absolute coincidence of freedom and responsibility. And to end on the subject of sexuality, sexuality is the ultimate example of this coincidence. It's not an accident that Kafka has these weird short circuits whereby sexuality presents some missing perspective. Sexuality, in Freud's terms, is the missing perspective as such, not a particular perspective, but the structure itself of the missing perspective. The reason why sexuality is so traumatic is because it is something which I lack the guilt, and yet nonetheless I am guilty. In just being sexualized, I have some kind of guilt. But Freud's point was never, civilization and its discontents is that we don't appreciate that we're just sort of sexualized creatures, and it's bourgeois mores that get in the way, and if we just got rid of naive bourgeois society, we would be free to be sexual creatures. No. Sexuality, rather like freedom, is also something that is already there. How did it get there? Implicates us in the perverse mystery of reality itself. And in a sense, this gets back to not only, the Freudian question of why do our dreams present themselves in the hysterical or theatrical way that they do, even though they're basically theaters of nothing, right? Pure caricatures. But also the fact that all of Kafka's stories sort of feel like a child discovering the mystery of sexuality or the mystery of their parents' enjoyments, to put it in a more classic way. One should almost risk an interesting reversal here, and I return to a phrase of yours, Enzo, the sort of frightening clarity. What happens with the child is not that they see something, their parents having sex, or they get caught up in the fact of their parents' enjoyment and then they can't explain it. But rather, it is utterly clear to them what is going on. And it's this very clear fact of enjoyment or sexuality, which is so difficult to gentrify, to reintegrate into the sort of quote-unquote normal developmental evolution of the personality, or indeed the normal development of political society. And this is what becomes so problematic for the Kafka personages, but also for the child. And there's a wonderful line of Zizek's when he argues that the break of the child with their narcissistic enclosure. Narcissism is a developmental stage. It's perfectly normal in a child to be sort of very self-focused. But what breaks open the narcissistic enclosure is the mystery, the unbearable question, the frighteningly clear fact, actually, of enjoyment, of the mystery of enjoyment, of the mystery of parental enjoyment, the mystery of sexuality. And in Kafka, therefore, it's not a surprise that sexuality is this short circuit, which gives us an insight. But of course, it doesn't give us a particular insight. It gives us the setup of the structure of an insight itself. Sexuality implicates us in the fact that even reality itself is a particular theater, a theater which attempts to gentrify the absolute coincidence of freedom and responsibility.
Yeah, I'm really glad we started talking about sexuality in Kafka, because I do think it's a vein running through perhaps all the stories and the letters, right? Or the lack of sexuality, perhaps, in the letters. and also the novels, right? There's a weird vulgarity if you look at any of the novels that runs through all of them, right? For example, in the trial, as Joseph K goes through the labors of finding the court where he has to defend his case, he encounters this lady who's a secretary but lives in front of the court, right? She's doing laundry, she's there, and she's seemingly transactioned by some presiding members of the court, but he's also entranced by her, and there's a weird vulgarity. I mentioned America earlier, that he meets a fat woman of some wealth who is taken by, or at least welcomes, I wouldn't call them friends, but two of his companions, and they're sort of almost enslaved by her in a sort of weirdly sexual way, crushed by her almost, right, by her weight that we mentioned already. Those are just examples to highlight the sort of the sexuality running through the stories of Kafka. Quite often, especially in the case of women in Kafka stories, they're often transaction. There's a sort of a weird transactional element to it, which would often, in academic contexts, would be ground to blame Kafka, or to somehow point at the fact that women take a minor role in the stories. And I do perhaps want to defend Kafka from that, but I was just going to pose that even as a question: what do we make of perhaps the minoring role, the lack of voice or voices for women who often have to speak through their bodies in most of the stories, or if that has any ground?
I definitely see what you mean when you say that they have more of a minor role. But I mean, at the same time, they are, as you've also already alluded to, Enzo, quite a threatening presence. Brunelda, as you mentioned, in America, who lives with Carl's companions. Also, another woman in America is the daughter of the character's uncle's friend. Yeah, so this kind of acquaintance, and they have this very awkward and also seemingly violent exchange when Carl, the character, visits this friend of his uncle's. I mean, in that story, it's actually interesting. I think it's almost a bit of a foreboding, or foreshadowing, rather, interaction, because shortly after that interaction, in which it seems like the girl, Clara, wants something, sexually, perhaps from Carl, and Carl kind of refuses and just kind of lies down. Shortly after, he then learns that his uncle has actually rejected him out of not entirely clear motives.
One thing perhaps I want to clarify, although it is true that, there seems to be a sense in which Kafka's women, or the women in Kafka, are transaction, I do think they have a role to play in that. It's not that they're just sort of merchandise being toyed around. That there's an active role being played by some of the women, right? Another example would be in a trial when Joseph K finally gets a lawyer. As soon as his uncle introduces him to a lawyer, a reputable lawyer, seemingly, who's quite sick, but has a servant there, or a maid. And instead of listening to the lawyer, he goes to the other room and does a nefarious thing with the maid or the servant. So that becomes his entry point into the law, which the servant, rather than the lawyer. But anyways, there's also a short story which I might point to. We maybe don't have time to read it today, but there's a quite interesting retelling of the Homeric myth of the sirens. So it's called The Silence of the Sirens, in which instead of having the sirens singing, right, their voice as the strongest weapon they had, it was actually their silence, which might be some form of, you mentioned foreshadowing, but here foreboding of the minor role in Kafka's women, that perhaps in their silence, or their lack of inner voice that we've been talking about, which is the power, the authority, at least in the narrative sense in Kafka, is the inner monologue. But the lack thereof, especially for Kafka's women in the stories, might be actually a sense of their strongest weapon, in the same way that the sirens in Kafka's retelling a story, the strongest weapon is not their singing, but their silence. If you want to look at it, just take a look. It might be a way to formulate a defense.
I mean, the women they appear in these compromising circumstances for the law. So there's obviously a relationship between the establishment of the law and the enjoyment. And both of you effectively mentioned that. And this gets at the heart of, I would say, again, the structure of Kafka's oeuvre, as far as trying to figure out the mystery of something like sexuality and enjoyment on one level. But they are themselves just stages and or theaters for figuring out, okay, you might say, the mystery of reality, or the implications that one finds within trying to gentrify something like enjoyment, figure out a coherent political collective on the basis of enjoyment. And the law is, again, the ultimate, not just attempt to try and gentrify enjoyment, but the fact that the law gets caught up in enjoyment says something about the ultimate status of the law, right? Its purpose is not naively, clearly, to just be opposed to enjoyment. And, I mean, there's an excellent argument from Zizek's, which is basically that, again, rather than reading Kafka as a character or his protagonists as being caught up in the law of a society, again, external to them, which puts pressure upon them to conform, to be bourgeois, to submit to the social mores of the time, Zizek is very interested in the fact that it's actually this perversion of the inner law, the thing, again, in me more than myself, which totalitarian and fascist societies take advantage of, insofar as their entire point is, go enjoy. And even more perversely, we know what you want. At one point, Zizek even describes this as the voice that is inside you like a parasite. It's inside you, but of course, it's not part of you. And it's telling you what to do because it thinks it knows better than you. So this is not just the law telling you what you should do in a normative sense, in an ethical sense, but the difference between one version of that law and the law of kind of pure enjoyment, follow your heart, which has intersected with some political project which seeks to take absolute advantage of the capacity that it has to know better than you what you enjoy. And then all of the self-sacrificing that happens, say, in the context of the fascist state, is an example of this kind of politicization of enjoyment, and particularly this inner law. In this sense, I think the status of women in Kafka is not at all like some kind of insignificant transactional chip or instrument or tool or sort of muted device. I think you're right to sort of highlight that, no, the mutism in and of itself signals something important. One, we should reject any naive fantasy that there's something obvious to say. Right? Kafka's characters themselves are already caught up in the impossibility of speech and representation and language. But perhaps a little bit more interestingly, it's that these characters, again, represent what cannot be simply represented because the law occupies the place of representation, which is enjoyment. And in a sense, the women in Kafka are kind of both innocent and guilty. They have a kind of contaminated innocence. Another regularly decried and denounced distinction, which comes from Freud, the hysterical subject, right? These women who were, to an extent, dismissed or sent for medical treatment on the basis that they just could not integrate and would have illnesses or bouts of, again, hysteria, of hyperactivity, and a rejection of any naive social inclusion. Freud's radical sexualization of this hysteria was a crucial clinical and theoretical move in that, these women were caught up in the repressed presence of enjoyment in bourgeois society, which of course upheld certain mores of marriage and function of women. And in a sense, their enjoyment bore witness not to some particular guilt or sexual proclivity that they had to hide, and which was the basis of their rejection by society and, say, their consequent hysteria. But on the contrary, they themselves were pointing out the dirty secret of society, which no one could just gentrify. There is no political society that just has an answer for sexuality or enjoyment. In a sense, this is what the hysterics of Freud bore witness to this more kind of radically general guilt. So the extent to which the women in Kafka participate in particular sexual acts is, in a sense, is a smokescreen and or a form of paranoia which conceals the problem of enjoyment itself. Kafka has other versions of this which are almost more radical, and one I can think of comes from the story A Country Doctor, where at one point this guy who is a doctor and has to go treat this guy who has this horribly gross wound, a description of which is like one of those absolute descriptions that you get in Kafka. For a description of reality, once it is stripped of almost all of its ideological theaters, of course you don't get a clear image of reality, you get a kind of a wound, a gap, something radically unfinished, but which really exists in its unfinishedness. But there's another part in the story when at one point he goes into a bar, the protagonist, and he sees a man on all fours. And something about this sort of bestial image, which is completely Freudian. And also the fact of how do you gentrify this image? Like what even in the literary narrative is this character doing? The arrangement of on all fours like an animal, and there are endless examples of this even just within this story. Weird, hysterical happenings. People who are not only not engaged in their proper social role, but nor are they, the good Sartrean existentialist freedom fighters either. Their role is like properly hysterical. Again, in that the hysteric is someone who is guilty, but doesn't know how to escape the implication of their own guilt. Like, again, a Kafka character, how do you establish the law when the very framework of the law itself involves and implicates you in enjoyment? What you need is something beyond the law. Funnily enough, enjoyment itself was Freud's answer to what was beyond the pleasure principle. But there is no naive gentrification, and these characters, like the man on all fours in A Country Doctor, get at in what respect this is a problem for reality itself. The arrangement of realities, even the very physical arrangement of realities, never mind the political arrangements of reality, are caught up in this one failure of representation, that there is this kind of weird materiality to reality which demands these kinds of impossible narratives. And this is properly the philosophical and political problem which Kafka introduces, that reality itself is a distortion. It's not about a choice between really functioning people who actually we show are hypocrites, and we need to get to this released Dionysian, Nietzschean kind of properly free subject. But the gap between the two of them, right? The gap of, as Zizek would put it, reality with itself, or the fact that reality basically is a distortion. Reality is a theater which attempts to compensate for this distortion, which is not, again, a really existing distortion, some really existing kernel of what's called the real, but the distortion inherent itself in the need for theater. Again, maybe as an example of this, a further twist is this gap in something like the figure of the father, right? Between a father on the one side who is sick and weak, and the father who has the unbearable presence of psychic authority. And the story which best represents this, of course, is The Judgment of Kafka, where you have the sick father who eventually, in a crazy turn, is revealed to be this kind of all-knowing father who actually has been in communication with the protagonist's friend, who the protagonist has been wary of telling about his recent engagement to. The answer is not simply to say, on the one hand, okay, I have to accept my father as this weak, imperfect figure in this kind of new age humanist approach, or, okay, I have to accept the law in its pure injunction. We just have to accept it and negotiate with it. People have this kind of psychic weight. Again, in our age, this is definitely kind of Peterson, who has his own twist on, such things as women in the workplace. Why do you think they're wearing lipstick? Because they are engaged in the law of sexuality. But this obviously misses the point, which is that, well, the law itself is corrupted by the very presence of enjoyment. Enjoyment is the thing that makes the law possible, insofar as it also corrupts it. It's not something that just provides some good functionality, which leftists are simply underestimating. No, the whole point that Kafka makes possible, he literally comes up with the kind of impossible materiality of this possibility, you might say, which is the gap itself one has to get interested in, the gap between the two versions of the father. The gap that itself sustains the figure of the father, because, of course, to collapse the gap is to engage with psychosis. Lacan's definition of psychosis is when the gap between, reality and the unconscious strictly collapses. It's not about collapsing between the two options, but sustaining the gap itself, recognizing the kind of unbearable presence of this gap, which is what totalitarianism tries to gentrify and organize. It is a properly kind of secular monarchy, totalitarianism, but it misses the point that But you can't fully just gentrify the gap, though, with another order that simply knows how to politicize the gap. This is not even possible. Because what you get, of course, in totalitarianism is the purest version of surveillance for Kafka, the purest vision of you're guilty for not knowing what you're guilty for, the sort of pure generation of your guilt. For this reason, of course, totalitarianism becomes absolutely coincidental with politics as pure theater, right? The show trials of the Stalinists and so on. And this means that the answer, again, is not simply to recognize in what respect politics is always already theater, and we have to kind of engage in a certain performance, and there's a performativity to the law, but rather that reality itself is caught up in the irreducible need to engage in narration, and that this act generally collapses, and that, resuscitating it or rehabilitating it requires an intervention not simply on behalf of a fiction, but on behalf of the fiction that reality itself is, right? The reality itself that already necessitates fiction. It's maybe worth mentioning that, in this story as well, there is already this coincidence with the awkward reference that the friend with whom the father has actually been communicating with and knows everything, and the father has told them about the engagement already, is in Russia during the time of the Russian Revolution. What Kafka himself makes of this is unclear. All one can say is that Kafka privileges the protagonist, I would argue, actually over the friend who is in the passionate engagement in the revolution. One should stand up for Kafka's own sort of anxious defense of the protagonist, who doesn't know anything, but somehow also knows everything, is implicated in the unconscious awareness that doesn't possess any particular awareness of some specified guilt. One should defend this insofar as one should not go for the option of naive political revolution as an answer to the problem of this gap.
There's a lot to mention. Perhaps simply as a note, the judgment, which is the story that Aidan is mentioning, was even by Kafka's own accord, sort of his breakthrough story. He wrote it apparently in the span of a night with very little editing, and was the beginning of a very productive period for Kafka. One of the rare but very productive periods of the span of a couple months. He wrote The Trial as well, just to speak of the importance for the mature Kafka that we know today. The story itself is quite important. But you also mentioned The Country Doctor, and one thing that I really like about this idea of the wound, or even the title itself, The Country Doctor, or the role that the doctor in the story embodies, is quite similar to Kafka's position historically. Not being sort of a doctor up to date with the standards of Kafka's time, with scientific discovery and improvements in hygiene, dealing with the wound, right? The wound which we might equate to consciousness or reality itself. The wound of the 19th century would be, to Freud's own words, sort of the wound of consciousness, or the wound of the unconscious. And in The Country Doctor, you have, again, not the doctor who's at the top of the field, but the country bumpkin who's sort of a little bit behind with today's standards. He's sort of caught up in between still their sort of religious, ritualistic ideas of, what being a doctor or a country doctor might entail, and then the scientific discoveries and innovations and improvements that are coming along. So this sort of in-between figure of the country doctor whose best procedure is to give his word, right? The word of authority of the doctor. Listen, I've seen way worse wounds and you'll be fine. Or actually to get naked himself and to get closer to the wound, as if that ritual itself, which is anything but up-to-date modern procedures to deal with the wound, might actually be the way to go. So I think that also embodies sort of Kafka's positioning, either politically or historically, and sort of the four minorities that he had to juggle his identity.
The wound in the story is this kind of, it's the appearance of I love this distinction of sort of scientific society into the outer regions, into the rural parts of the country, and which this country doctor is then confronted with without really actually the answer. There's no idea what to do. But this wound is not even caused in particular by, again, alienation or technology or even science itself. But it's this almost accidental cleavage produced by the scientific doctor. Again, if we have the two fathers, we have sort of the two doctors. And the fact that modernity opens up a space of freedom, which isn't simply, okay, now the project of collective society is to figure out how to live with the fact of pure subjectivity, of radical emancipation, but the much more Hegelian question, or even kind of the question you would find in Schelling, the kind of radically unconscious question of how is the freedom already there? In a sense, it's not just that this freedom is what the country doctor interacts with in its modern sense, that these people are sort of sick with the invasion of modernity, but that he himself, as you mentioned, embodies the old approach, the old status of this wound, which maybe the old philosophies had forgotten existed. They didn't realize that their traditions were a kind of uncanny reference to the wound itself of freedom. And this is why the doctor also gets reinscribed into the weird kind of bestial animal drive traditionalisms and sort of pure rituals, as he does in the story, and everyone kind of goes more or less hysterical throughout the story in the presence of this wound and in the presence of the doctor, because not only is it the invasion of modernity, it's the kind of re-traumatization of pre-modern life, of the existing traditions that you also cannot just go back to, because they're revealed to have always already been caught up in the question of freedom themselves.
Just as a way to illustrate your point, there's another great story that I like. There's so many, but one is Report to an Academy, which is a story or a speech, very eloquent speech given by someone who was formerly an ape. And so coming to terms with his own freedom or his own new emancipation or refinement. And, part of that speech erupts from the fact that he's wounded again. And that wound grants his name. That only an ape could give him such a name, but because he's wounded as an ape, he's now called the Red Peter because of the red wound that he has. And then through the naming, he becomes more and more refined and finally is able to give a speech to the Academy. He's seemingly addressed to somebody, but just speak to this idea of freedom that you've been mentioning, this sort of weird, eloquent speech given by someone who was formerly an ape, which I guess seemingly we all were to some degree. It also speaks to Kafka's hilarious nature. I also want to mention, we've talked about Kafka, the woman in Kafka, but not too much about the woman in Kafka's life, which play anything but a minor role in Kafka's writing, but also Kafka's life. Even if we could be duped by the fact that there's quite a muted presence, I think we disputed that, but there's sort of a transactional nature in the position that the woman played in Kafka's stories. It's quite the opposite if you read the letters, especially. It's worth mentioning, both for the frightening clarity that we find in Kafka's stories or Kafka's novels, but also for the value they provide. Kafka was eloped with a lady living in Berlin called Felicia Bauer, who's often, when we meet seemingly important women figures in Kafka's novels or story, their initials are often FB as a reference to Felicia Bauer. Throughout their engagement, which failed multiple times, we have to mention, Kafka is enamored with her. He writes up to 2 letters a day that he sends by mail from Prague every day for years, and fails to consummate the relationship. Actually, he's brought, so this is seemingly Kafka's own trial, but one day, Felicia Bauer and a friend, when Kafka goes to Berlin, he's brought over sort of in a weird, shameful sort of court trial in front of the family and everything to sort of challenge Kafka on the seriousness of his engagement towards Felicia Bauer. One of the reasons that prompted that is because the friend who was acting as a chaperone between Felicia Bauer and Kafka was starting to receive, these seemingly enamored, weirdly intense letters from Kafka's as well. Later on, Kafka would also do the same with his Czech editor, Milena. So Kafka's women were often sort of the vessel for him to, even during very long periods of writer block, he would be able to outpour some of his writing towards these female figures. So Kafka's own sort of shameful trial in front of the family of his fiancée brought about the trial that we know today. So that there's quite an interesting story about this, a noble writer himself. Yeah, quite worth looking into. Just to make a distinction between the woman in Kafka's stories and the woman in Kafka's life, which were anything but minor, and Kafka's own failure to consummate, or the lack of sexuality in Kafka's own life, which might inform our understanding of the sexuality in Kafka's stories.
Well, maybe it's important, I think, this return to his biography. He also had a very difficult relationship with his father. and also wrote a very long letter to his dad, which was eventually published, but was never sent to his dad, and is this extraordinarily intimate account of how his father has made him feel. And over the most trivial things, often, the strength of the father versus the small, vulnerable child, and the severity of the father in the context of a child who feels defenseless, and again, already guilty, caught up in the questions of modernity, of how does anyone explain their guilt to themselves in 1900, you know what I mean? Without the political catastrophes of the age, which you have had such a fundamental change in the study of sexuality, in the study of human guilt, but also the reflective impossibility of normally regulating any relationship. What does a father and son mean anymore in modernity when all social bonds have been cast aside? And I think in the context of, the failed engagement, we've seen this before. We saw it with Kierkegaard, right? Who also cannot finish this engagement that he has to Regina. And to me, it is important that we try and identify who Kafka was, not because we're trying to do a sort of psychobiography of him, but we already mentioned it actually in the Kierkegaard episode towards the end, that, the status of Kafka, say as a writer, as a failed writer, as a failed political revolutionary, we argued at one point, is what the challenge of reading him consists in. I mean, there is a fair bit of context, or a kind of unbearable sense as you read him, not that you have to do something, but of the very impossibility of doing anything, which is itself not a naive result. Let's again contrast this problem of Kafka's with the philosophical turn of nihilism, something that both Nietzsche to an extent and Dostoevsky absolutely railed against, right? This collapse into this sort of non-believingness. But Kafka doesn't sort of fall for this trick. For him, even if nothing is there, it's not an accident. And it's not as if, therefore, there's some supreme creator that has put nothing there. But the fact that even nothing implicates itself in some frame of appearance, of introduction, or of installation, is what signals the irreducibility of this guilt. And it's this guilt that kind of overwhelms not just our modern society, but our attempts to recapture some pre-modern moment or event. In this sense, the ape story reminds one of Marx's line that one has to study the anatomy of man, actually, to understand the anatomy of the ape. And as you already mentioned, Enzo, I mean, we were once apes, but how one should organize the logic here is, in order to understand the ape, you have to introduce the radical texture of human freedom, or the freedom that we try and explain and confine to political society, as it would relate to the ape. Only then could you begin telling a history of human society or nature, or even of reality itself. One can even return briefly to the castle, insofar as one can see nothing happens. But in order to understand this as a plot line, just repeat it. Nothing happens, right? There is some happenstance to nothing itself, and this in and of itself becomes the political and philosophical problem. And this is absolutely a link, though, a very interesting link between Kafka and Kierkegaard, and Kafka and Dostoevsky, and that both Kierkegaard and Kafka refuse the obvious revolutions of their time. In fact, both Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky choose the radical Christian revolution, which we also discussed in the last episode. Maybe one has to argue that Kafka's unwillingness to go there is him holding to the pure secular appearance of something like a Christian revolution or the crucifixion, or nothing itself, i.e. the appearance of this coincidence between freedom and responsibility, the nothing itself that nonetheless happens, that is nonetheless there, has to be treated as a purely secular phenomenon in order to understand the unbearable sort of materiality it leaves us with, or the conditions of the real, which Zizek unbelievably extraordinarily refers to at one point as the dog whistle. The whistle you can't hear, but you can nonetheless imagine it's there. Reality structures itself with respect to a dog whistle, not with respect to some unbearably transcendent truth, but with respect to an absence that nonetheless has some status. Reality is missing. It's not functional or finished, but it's not simply not there. It's sort of missing. in this nonetheless implicating way. And there is really the unbearable struggle to some extent of political society is how to actually coordinate with the injunction that comes from nowhere, which you can only meet with a fiction. In mathematics, there's a sort of running joke that it's an imaginary object in a hypothetical space. One has to sort of repeat that strange logic here, and that the challenge of political society, or the challenge that Kafka leaves us with, is one of having an imaginary voice that tells us what to do, which is structured in a fiction that, right, it's structured in a fiction, structured in something that doesn't exist, or coordinates the structure of something that itself doesn't exist. This kind of doubling down on the weird imaginary, fictional, or you might say negative conditions of reality itself. How to imagine this as a philosophical, literary, or even political emancipatory project is extremely difficult. And whether one should choose between the secular approach of Kafka or the kind of Christian revolutionary approach of Dostoevsky or Kierkegaard, to me, it's a false opposition. Obviously, already there is a strange secular core, even to the Christian revolution, something we also discussed last episode. And the challenge is almost to try and understand how Christianity concerns itself with a difficult and impossible secularity, almost as if secularity is not the neutral result, but the radically non-neutral result, the appearance of some kind of secularity in the midst of this injunction from nowhere, law from nowhere, voice from nowhere. Secularity, in a sense, is the ultimate religious achievement, or in this case, political, philosophical achievement.
It seems like in his relationship with women, maybe in his own life, but then also in the stories, there is precisely a guilt over nothing, right? A guilt over what didn't happen with the women. As an example of this, in America, as I mentioned, there is this weird interaction with the daughter of his uncle's friend, and right at the beginning, there's somehow the sense that like something incriminates her, and then, you know, they do have this awkward interaction, and then after, the character Carl actually hears from a servant in the house that the woman is engaged to a friend of his, and he had no idea about this, and yet she kind of seemingly wanted to get them in this weird situation. You know, you could be like, oh, now Carl, the character, should be relieved because it turned out what incriminated her was actually that she was about to deceive him, or maybe even be unfaithful to her fiancé, or who knows what. But the character is not at all relieved by this. He's just even more, it's not that he's more guilty, but it's like you see how what incriminated her from the beginning was somehow his own guilt, that he was going to fail, or that actually nothing was going to happen. And so this kind of admission then within the arc of the story of her guilt and of her deceit doesn't do much for the character.
Maybe going back to our last episode, we started with the question, can we have Kierkegaard without God? And perhaps the answer is Kafka here. Kafka was a reader, an avid reader. He wasn't Christian himself, but he was an avid reader of both Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky. So that's worth mentioning, especially later on in his life. Kafka, maybe in his own guilt, right, or the lack thereof, on his deathbed had two books, one of which was the Bible, weirdly enough, and then the Sentimental Education by Flaubert, two of his favorite books. He was returning quite often to Kierkegaard for a source of a good, ironic laughter, yes, but also for some form of solace. He said he was a long-lost brother, I think, in one of his journals.
I like that we started with Kafka's death, and we've returned to his death and the significance of these two books, and the significance, in a sense, of the sort of strange religious secularism, you might say, of Kafka. Reading the Bible almost because it contains within it, you know, the ultimate example of the laws, but also the ultimate story of their failure, and the sort of strange New Testament that emerges to try and coordinate this very failure, and in fact even repeat this failure, the original failure of Adam. Kafka is much more, you know, than a literary project for this reason, and much more than just a writer, which sort of addresses another question we asked at the very beginning of what is the philosophical status of Kafka? One of the things about writing itself, and one of the things about literature, is it's not accidentally philosophical. You know what I mean? And it's not in the sense that it deals with the great cosmic themes of the universe or morality or truth or beauty, but because there is something irreducibly unconscious about literature itself, about the very places we go in order to try and inscribe the passing of time or the strange materialities in which we find ourselves, or even with only imprints, really, try and organize an impossible collective project or address a dog whistle, as it were, of collectivity itself. And I think Kafka has given us the ultimate series of manuals that don't work, in a sense, for how to coordinate our subjectivity in the context of this failure of modern society, which is not simply a failure of something to show up, right? Not simply a failure of we don't have good enough wages, why is there not less war, or why don't we have prosperous enough culture or greater sense of connectivity. And Kafka is almost interested in presenting the pure failure itself of the human, in a sense, or even, again, reality, and trying to show in what respect there is this strange, uncanny history that one cannot repress or reject, as one looks back and sees in what respect this failure was already present. They're coordinating the theater, as it were, of the very books which we have read and used to try and coordinate our present critiques or even our present moral and social lives. And there's a wonderful opening to one of maybe the great inheritors of Kafka, the Hungarian author Laszlo Krasznahorkai, who at the very beginning of Satan Tango quotes an FK, whom I'm sure we can imagine is Franz Kafka, and quotes the following, "And so I'll miss the thing by waiting for it." And all of Krasznahorkai's book is about waiting for something to show up. And in a sense, Kafka already has an answer to this unbearable expectation of emancipation or connection, which is, of course, well, the very thing that you're waiting for has already showed up in the form of that which is missing, in the form of that which has already failed.
That takes place quite specifically and also in one of the parables that's often mentioned in Kafka called Before the Law, which is this grim image of someone and they're sitting before a huge door wanting to be let in, and the person said, sorry, not at the moment, and he waits until he passes away, and before passing he asks, I've never seen anybody else pass through the door of the law. Well, the door is only intended for you and you've never asked since the moment. Now it's too late. I'm just going to close the door. Standing before the law, really at the limits of the law, but not being let in, but the door only being for you is quite the image here. There's also, right, you were talking about the dog whistle. If people remember earlier in the story that I've read, the departure, right? There's the sound, the fateful sound of the trumpet that only the master hears. The servant doesn't hear it. It's quite prophetic, but there's no speech, there's no command or anything. It's just a fateful sound of a trumpet that nobody else is capable of hearing. So similar to the dog whistle. I think those are good images to keep in mind.
Absolutely. In part because the law is staged there as empty. And this is the ultimate paradox of reality. That reality, again, has a certain appearance, a certain theater, but it's fictional. There's no interior content. To get back to the original metaphor, the treasure hunt of Kafka, the ultimate lesson is that there's nothing there. But not simply, oh, it's absent and you were silly to have expected something, but this sort of signified absence. This absence that nonetheless was staged for you. This is the ultimate example of reality does not show up, but it's not simply some nihilistic incoherence, but reality, either for this reason, is staged, is caught up in the question of its own frame, not unlike, the stories of Kafka, where the frame itself gets complicated, the frame of narration, but that reality is sort of staged for you in that it has this irreducible fictional texture. The trumpet is it's like the call of the real, for a character. But the fact that no one else hears it is, obviously in the story, it's always meant to be this uncanny, trivial detail that is nonetheless the secret of the entire story. But it's also, yes, an example, as you say, of this dog whistle, but an example really of this impossible to hear thing that nonetheless has some role in staging reality's setup or the setup of political society. It's almost as if the challenge of a political collective is to figure out what its trumpet is, what the sound is that no one can hear, but people ready to hear it. And this is a very Kierkegaardian analysis, maybe in a slightly more naughty and difficult sense, to come up with a trumpet which is not even, again, strictly heard, as in, the trumpet of the coming judgment, or indeed at the very end of Krasznahorkai's novel, the bell, which rings or fails to ring as a signal for the end of the world or the apocalypse. The construction of a bell or a trumpet that is not strictly heard in the sense of just there for everyone, universally accessible, but obviously, to put it in kind of more Hegelian language, the presence itself of some kind of universal choice, which you can only hear if you somehow accept the responsibility of the choice or accept responsibility itself.
Yeah, I wanted to just point out another aspect of this, which is present in the parable that Enzo told. In the trial, the person who tells Kay the parable, they go through different interpretations of it together, and it kind of turns out, first Kay thinks, oh, the guard deceived the man in front of the gate, but then the person who tells the story says, no, actually the guard is deceived because XYZ. And yeah, that points to an interesting aspect of the situation where it's not a question of, as we've also mentioned before now many times, authority kind of deceiving you, and actually it has this other goals, but it all makes sense. It's more like, no, there's no deception involved, but that doesn't mean that now it somehow makes sense without your participation.
There's so many things to say about the parables. I mean, or Kafka's message in general. Like, if we were to think, is Kafka's message to us through his writings sort of a failed message, or what philosophical message does he leave us with, or right, what is the revolution that we have to take on to some degree, literary or philosophical to some degree? And there's perhaps no better way to represent Kafka's message than through the other parable that is quite infamous, called the Imperial Message, which might be worth actually just reading. The Imperial Message. The emperor, so the parable runs, has sent a message to you, the humble subject, the insignificant shadow cowering in the remotest distance before the imperial sun. The emperor from his deathbed has sent a message to you alone. He has commanded the messenger to kneel down by the bed and has whispered the message to him. So much store did he lay on it that he ordered the messenger to whisper it back into his ear again. Then, by a nod of the head, he has confirmed that it is right. Yes, before the assembled spectators of his death, all the obstructing walls have broken down, and on the spacious and loftily mounting open staircase stand in a ring the great princes of the empire. But for all these he has delivered his message. The messenger immediately sets out on his journey, a powerful and unfatigable man, now pushing with his right arm, now with his left. He cleaves a way for himself through the throng. If he encounters resistance, he points to his breast where the symbol of the sun glitters. The way is made easier for him than it would be for any other man. But the multitudes are so vast, their numbers have no end. If he could reach the open fields, how fast he would fly. And soon, doubtless you would hear the welcome hammering of his fist on your door. But instead, how vainly does he wear out his strength. Still, he is only making his way through the chambers of the innermost palace. Never will he get to the end of them. And if he succeeded in that, nothing would be gained. He must next fight his way down the stairs. And if he succeeded in that, nothing would be gained. The courts would still have to be crossed. And after that, the second outer palace would have to be crossed. And once more, stairs and courts. And once more, another palace, and so forth for thousands of years. And if at last he should burst through the outermost gates, but never can that happen, the imperial capital would lie before him, the center of the world, crammed to bursting with its own sediment. Nobody could fight his way through here, even with a message from a dead man. But you sit at your window when evening falls and dream of it yourself.
Yeah, fabulous reading, and gets at the difficulty of reading Kafka, and the fact that there is a bigger project that you're implicated in when you read Kafka, whether you like it or not. And if you take it upon yourself to spread the good word of Kafka, or the good word of anything for that matter, you should anticipate the weird materiality, the paradoxes, the sort of strange setup, which is not simply there, again, as Helena pointed out, just to deceive you, but it's a more absolute deception. It's the pain of having to take on the decision yourself and be responsible for what is there, and that absolute reality itself is engaged in the very frame of its own setup and the framework of responsibility, and that there is this sort of message that reality has, but it has no content. It's just the pure message. And anyone trying to either live or figure out where they are, as a writer or in politics or in philosophy, itself, has to deal with this unbearable insight that reality has the structure of a message, but has no content.
It has no content, but it has weight, though. That's the whole point of the Imperial message, right? That somehow the content or the message has to be delivered, but you'll never get to the end. But somehow you still dream about it. This adventure, right? That you set on, that seemingly has no limits, but also an infinite amount of limits at the same time, right? That somehow there's no barriers. You have this imperial authority that you carry with you that allows you to move effortlessly throughout the innermost until you reach somehow the core of anything, right? But you'll never get there. But that's still your motivation to set on to your journey, and that somehow you have to respect the words of a dead man. And if we take the dead man to be Kafka here, that's maybe something to take on seriously, right? I think quite a noble message, but also a funny one. There's so many layers to this story, and it speaks again to this idea that I mentioned earlier, this Kafka treasure trove, this treasure hunt, right? Of Kafka drawing us a map, but never giving us the treasure we have to unpack it ourselves. And we're in the same way that Fleur de Lacan would make us think about sexual encounters. You're bound to be disappointed, but that's also the invective to start, or at least the motivation to get going.